Hello everyone, welcome back. My name is Douglas Johnson if you're new here, and I am a certified yoga teacher, ordained minister, and kirtan artist, and I wanted to talk a little bit about the wound is where the light enters you, which is a quote from the Sufi mystic Rumi. Before I get into that, I do want to thank my patrons on Patreon. They make these talks possible, and if you'd like to join that community, please check out the links below. All right, so the wound is where the light enters you. So I said this is a quote from the Sufi mystic Rumi, and in my experience, this quote and some others that I'll share with you are really important, relevant, especially for me at this time, which is why I'm sharing it with you. And the reason for that, as many of you know, I have been struggling with a dark night of the soul for about approximately a year. And I may have emerged from it or pulled out of it at this point. It's very hard to say. But regardless of that, this lesson is with me. And this relates with my last talk where I was talking about, what is the lesson, finding the lesson in hardship. So what Rumi is saying is the wound is where the light enters you. The difficulty, the struggle, the suffering, the pain. For me, it was heartbreak, okay? That really was what sort of wounded me in a deep way. And why is this where the light enters us? Well, for whatever reason, as human beings, when things seem to be going well for us, we often don't question, and we're not as curious. We don't explore as much the nature of reality. We don't examine our thoughts. We don't examine our emotions. I'm generalizing. There may be people who just, that is their nature, but for most of us, if things are going well, we tend to just assume that, we've got it figured out. So for many of us, it's only when we are suffering and we are in some kind of a crisis. It might not be life or death, but it's some kind of a crisis, emotional or psychological crisis, where we say, what is going on? Why is this happening? What is wrong with me? Or how am I seeing things that would cause this to happen? And we become more open, quite literally, like mentally and psychologically, we open up. We are open to a new point of view because the point of view we have is causing us suffering. And that's a very good way to understand reality, that if I have a certain point of view, then that point of view might cause me, it's that point of view that's actually causing my suffering. If I could just switch perspectives or point of view. Now, suffering is different than physical pain. So I'm not really talking about physical pain. I am talking about psychological suffering, which is what spirituality generally is here to address for us. As human beings, we seem to have the unique honor and perspective of being able to suffer psychologically. Yes, there may be other animals that do that, but for the most part, it seems like this is an affliction that haunts us as human beings more so than any other creature on the planet. So spirituality is to help us with that. We have these big brains, and they're such a great tool, but they also can be a curse as well as a blessing. So it tends to be when we are struggling that we look for deeper meaning, deeper answers. We open up. And this is what Rumi means by the wound is where the light enters you. So if you are suffering, if you're struggling, this isn't something from a spiritual perspective to be completely upset about, or I'm not really finding the right word. It isn't something just to be sad about. There actually can be a lot of grace in that. One of my favorite Zen teachers, Muso Soseki, says that abundance or things going well for you can be a curse if that makes you complacent. And it causes you to not question and look into things. And he says that hardship can be a blessing if this causes you, again, to be more focused and determined spiritually at finding answers and being more disciplined in your practices. So again, we see from the Zen tradition very similar point of view. Rumi was like I said, a Sufi mystic, which Sufism is usually seen as coming out of the Islamic or Muslim faith. So Zen, very different tradition from different part of the world. Buddhist, this is a Japanese teacher I'm quoting, but similar point of view, that if you've got it easy and you think you got it figured out, and so you aren't really questioning things, you aren't examining the nature of reality or your thoughts, then that might actually be a curse, not a blessing. You might think it's a blessing because you're on easy street, but from that perspective, where Buddhists believe that we live many lives, and so if in this life I have it easy because of good karma, and I don't use that to develop myself spiritually, then in a sense it's a waste, right? And then from the yogic tradition, we have the image of the lotus, and this is one of my favorite spiritual teachings, if you will, the symbol of the lotus flower. So why is the lotus the symbol of enlightenment in both in Buddhism and yoga and other traditions? Reason for this is the lotus floats on top of like a lake, and it's a very beautiful flower. It's just there floating on the top of the lake. But if you were to look at the lotus, how does a flower float on the top of a lake? What's going on? Well, if you follow it down, what you find is that the stem goes all the way down into the muck at the bottom of the lake or the pond. And so the lotus is seen as this symbol of enlightenment because it is growing out of this muck. I don't know if you've ever actually been in a real like pond or stream. I grew up, we had a country home where we would go and swim in this. It was a little lake, but when you got in the lake, there was this muck at the bottom, and there were creatures that lived in the muck. It was very slimy. It didn't really feel good on your feet. There were leeches and bloodsuckers, so you would put your feet in there and you'd get out, and you might have leeches on your feet and ankles and lower legs. So generally this muck at the bottom of a lake or a pond is not seen as a good thing. It's seen as a undesirable thing. We wouldn't want to hang out down there. But the lotus has its roots in that muck. It starts from the muck, and then it comes up through the water. Now, interestingly, the water, in many traditions, water represents the unconscious. So interesting that the lotus has its roots in the nitty-gritty, the dirt, the muck of our everyday life, the hardship, the suffering of our everyday life. And then it comes up through the water, possibly the water of the unconscious. And then it blooms as this beautiful, beautiful flower at the surface of a lake or a pond. Now, from my perspective, this is more or less the same teaching that we're getting from Rumi and that Muso Soseki is talking about. That generally speaking, on a spiritual path, and that's what this channel is all about. It's not about worldly gains or accomplishments, but really about the spiritual path. From this perspective, it is our very suffering, it is our difficulty, it is the challenges that we meet in life that will give birth to this lotus, the lotus of enlightenment, of spiritual awakening. So again, if you are someone who has been struggling, as I have, then this is something to actually be, in a sense, grateful for. That the struggle can be used as grist for the mill. And I'll give you one other teaching from the Zen tradition, which is, there's a saying, turning weeds into fertilizer. So weeds, again, if they're growing up in your garden, they're seen as undesirable, things that you don't want. But what we'd like to learn to do is to turn those things into fertilizer for our spiritual growth and advancement. We don't know what we don't know. And what I mean by that is, as content as you might be, as happy as you might be, as enlightened as you might be, there may always be more that is possible for you. And so it is possible that while you may have had a very powerful spiritual awakening in the past, and it was life-changing, and you experienced a long period of just really enjoying that, suffering may come back in as a way of spurring you on toward greater development. And generally speaking, when we develop spiritually, we experience a corresponding amount of peace and bliss and joy that is of a transcendent nature. It doesn't have the same kind of ups and downs as ordinary happiness might have. There's nothing wrong with being happy. There's nothing wrong with pleasure per se. And there's not really anything wrong with pursuing these things from my perspective. I know some spiritual teachers might talk about, giving up all of those things. And I understand why they might say that. But I don't think we have to give up anything. We are, in our very nature, spiritual beings. And giving up something may be a means to an end. It may be necessary for certain people at a certain time. But that's as a means to an end. It's not an essential. Because nothing is essential for us to be spiritual because we already are spiritual. In the Zen tradition, everything and everyone is already enlightened. And this is, I think, a very serious statement. I think some people see that as a joke because they look around and they say, well, how can everything be enlightened? But from the enlightened perspective, this is the case. It's only from the unenlightened perspective that it seems like everyone and everything isn't enlightened. So in a sense, it doesn't make sense until we have achieved those lofty heights. So I hope that this is helpful for you. I know many people at this time are struggling in one way or another, and I myself have been struggling too. And so, as I said in a previous talk, we can ask why? What is the lesson? Where is the lesson? And in a similar way, we can know that we can use this wound, as Rumi would put it, or we can use the muck at the bottom of the lake. We can use this, or we can use the weeds, right, in our garden. And we can turn this into fertilizer. We can use this to grow spiritually. And that for most people, again, there can be an exception to every rule, but for most of us, it's only when we will experience these things that we will begin to ask these questions and begin to look deeper and go further and maybe seek out help from a teacher or a community or a scripture, whatever it might be. So I hope this was helpful. If there's any way I can be of service to you or help you, please reach out. Let me know. You can help me by liking, subscribing, commenting, and sharing. And of course, if you feel motivated to do so, you can join the community over on Patreon. Until next time, everyone, namaste, and have a beautiful, beautiful day.